Dobrý den, ako sa máte? I would like to thank Helen for inviting me to present today at the Slovak American Society. And thank you very much, Brian, for all of your tech support that you provided. I was fortunate to have attended Dr. Pavlovich's great presentation last month on Slovak migration. And this speaker series is wonderful, and it really is an honor to be here today. As Brian said, my name is Edward Snajdr. I am a professor of anthropology at John Jay College, City University of New York. My work focuses broadly on social justice movements and how they relate to culture and politics and power. And my talk today is titled Zelení Nahlas, Environmentalism in Slovakia in the Revolution and After. I'm actually going to focus more on before and in the revolution today. But before I go into my topic, I'd like to say a little bit more about me. In addition to working in Slovakia on environmental activism in the 1990s for my dissertation research in anthropology, I have also studied Muslim revitalization movements, law enforcement, domestic violence, and human trafficking in Kazakhstan in the 2000s, as well as other projects on law and culture in Eastern Europe and in Russia. My most recent work, which began in 2010, is on gentrification in Brooklyn, New York, where I live currently and am raising my kids. And I have a new book out on this called What the Signs Say, published in 2020, which I've co-authored with my colleague and linguist, Shauna Trench. As an anthropologist, I also know the value of artifacts, and I also want to give you my Slovak bona fides. Here is my great-grandmother's halushki pot, hrniec, which my dad gave to me after getting it from his Slovak mother. Now, my father passed away in 2005, so I'm kind of like the only one left in that family line. My grandmother and her mother were from Stupava, outside of Slovakia, outside of Bratislava, and she married into a Czech-American family from Moravia, which is where I get my German Czech spelling of the name Snyder. And they lived in the Midwest where my dad was born. My great-grandfather traveled to his hometown in the 1930s and brought back this pot for his wife, my great-grandmother. And if you can see the mark, made in Czechoslovakia. You know, the country had kind of just been created maybe a decade or two before. And of course, there's a lot of history in this pot. And I present it to you today as part of my own history with my connection to Slovakia. I did not speak Slovak before. I learned Slovak at the University of Pittsburgh while in graduate school. And at that time, the Iron Curtain was collapsing and Eastern Europe opened up, and it was an excellent opportunity to actually be allowed in to do field research. And I started to focus my ideas about studying that culture and that society at that time. And I want to acknowledge today Martin Votruba, the late Martin Votruba, was my professor of Slovak language, and I want to acknowledge his teaching and his mentoring. And also I would like to mention that the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, the International Research and Exchanges Board, and the Thomas Kukuczka Memorial Foundation have given me their support for doing the field research for the book that I present to you today. Thomas Kukuczka was a journalist in Pittsburgh from a Slovak American family, and he was planning to go to visit the homeland for the very first time, but unfortunately he died in a car accident. And so his family, in his memory, provided funds to graduate students and others who were traveling to that country. And I'm very grateful to his family for that opportunity and for the memory of Thomas. So my talk today highlights how Slovak environmentalism challenged state socialism. It's a story that I cover in detail in the book, Nature Protests, The End of Ecology in Slovakia. And it was published in 2008 by the University of Washington Press. And this book also tracks the fate of environmental activism as Slovakia became independent in the new world order of post-communist Europe. And the story I share with you today in particular is one of daring and bravery and creativity. The idea of ecology really inhabited a unique grassroots sphere in socialist Slovakia. And I will show how nature activists pushed the boundaries of conservation and ultimately found themselves playing leading roles during Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution. Just some background on methodology. I am an anthropologist, and here's me in somewhere in Slovakia in 1994. So I do field work. I live with the people, I learn the language, and I do what is called participant observation. I lived in Slovakia in 1993, briefly for a language training, and then in 1994 and 95 for this project that I am talking to you about today. It's not exactly the same as being on a Pacific island or working with hunter-gatherers like old school anthropology, but it does have the same principles. I lived in a Panelaki apartment for a year and a half in Bratislava. I worked at the Ethnology Institute as a researcher at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. And I joined a local environmental organization called Za Matku Zem, or For Mother Earth. And I also spent a lot of time with people just living in society. And here's a group of kids that I met on a boat down the Danube as we were touring the Gapčíkovo Dam. Spending a lot of time with young activists, I also learned a lot of slang and a lot of swear words in Slovakia, which I will not repeat here. But I also wanted to say that I had the opportunity to walk on foot across Slovakia from the border at Petržalka and the Austrian border all the way to Uzhgorod, which is the border with Ukraine. And it was a 3-week journey on an environmental demonstration and protest that was organized by an international group, but also by my local friends in Mother Earth, Slovakia, Za Matku Zem. And so I also had the fortunate experience of actually living, sleeping, staying, and meeting people in over 24 towns and villages across the country. And it was just an incredible experience as an ethnographer. But at the same time, I also interviewed people about things that happened in the past, and especially during and before the Velvet Revolution. And they also shared with me a lot of archives and personal materials and stories and information. And so in addition to the present day ethnographic fieldwork that I did, I also worked as a contemporary historian, if you will, piecing together events and the people from pretty much the very recent past. In terms of theory, anthropology tells us that all human societies separate nature and culture in some way. Now, this divide is, of course, variously constructed. Even members of hunting and gathering cultures, which are sort of commonly described as living in harmony in a local ecosystem, recognize and maintain distinct boundaries between a human and a natural realm. And of course, agricultural populations rely daily on nature's patterns, and they try to negotiate its uncertainties. And by contrast, industrial and post-industrial societies generally view the natural world as a sphere to be used in the service of human development. So across the board in the human experience, we definitely see a distinction between those realms. Marxist ideology placed a particularly sharp boundary between nature and culture. It relegated natural environments to the stark status of material resources. In fact, I believe this sharp nature-culture dichotomy of Marxism was one of the major shortcomings of state socialism. It significantly contributed to its demise. And I'd like to pause here for a minute to just clarify my terminology. State socialism refers to what we would call communism. And this was a good question that was raised last month in the chat in Dr. Pavlovich's talk on Slovak migrations. Slovaks say socialism, and people in that from that perspective use that term. Americans all through the Cold War, refer to it as communism. But political scientists like to refer to the regimes and to the systems in which those regimes had created as state socialism. And this is really the terminology that I use and subscribe to, although I will say socialist and communist back and forth. The socialist regimes thought that nature, they really imagined nature as a passive entity, and that as such, it could be readily subordinated, and it could be easily subdued. As a result of this hyper separation of nature from culture, and this is kind of an important point to my story, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union considered their main fight to be in the realm of culture. Their primary political battle was in that realm of the human. And in their fight to control the realm of culture, state socialist regimes in Eastern Europe could look readily to Soviet successes of the past 40 years in dominating and reforming long-standing traditional and indigenous lifeways. So from Russian kulaks, independent peasants, to Central Asian pastoralists, all of these were subjugated and had been by the time communism came to Eastern Europe. Inspired by these models, which really is a model of cultural repression, Eastern European socialist regimes responded severely to practically anything they perceived to be dissent, especially after the Prague Spring. This is a picture of Husak here, but in the wake of Alexander Dubček's political experiment, Socialism with a Human Face. The harsh period of normalization in Czechoslovakia that followed was an innovation of totalitarianism that went after dissidents from many parts of society, including the arts. Here's Václav Havel, a Czech playwright, the famous dissident, but also the regime went after education, other writers and artists, and the church. In Slovakia, for example, religious dissidents in the secret church were primary targets of the secret police, or the STB, the Štátní bezpečnost. And I know that Professor David Dollinger has spoken to this group in the past about his excellent work on the history of that important movement of the secret church. From samizdat, or self-produced writing, to subversive performances, to worshiping in secret, all of these acts were prominently characterized by the state as deviant and, therefore, dangerous, of course, to the regime. These acts were all cultural threats to socialism and were placed in a bucket of repression, along with more formal political organizations. These were all subsumed under the National Front, other political parties, if you will. And alongside these, the regime also monitored and censored youth groups and other community organizations and even social clubs who simply wanted to enjoy the pastime of stamp collecting. But in Slovakia, the communist regime remarkably overlooked people interested in nature. And this is where my story for you today begins. Just after normalization, in 1969, nature enthusiasts known as ochranáři, which is translated as protectors or conservationists, founded the Slovak Union of Nature and Landscape Protectors, or SZOPK, or in Slovak, Slovenský zväz ochrancov prírody a krajiny. And I know that's a mouthful to say, so I'm going to refer to them as the union as I go forward. The unique thing about this communist period organization was that it really did escape state control. When it was formed, it was left outside of the party and not included in the nomenclatura system, or the system of party loyalty and bureaucracy. It was even left out of the National Front. And why was this so? Even its members could not really say. They chalked it up to being volunteers, which in their sense felt they at first saw no clear political consequence for their actions in light of the state. While it did have a national centralized leadership, It was in reality a network of local nature groups who were free to choose their own interests and define themselves as they wished. And so the Conservation Union stood alone as the only truly independent organization in Slovak society under state socialism. And it was in the context of this incredibly unmonitored union that a geographer from the Slovak Academy of Sciences, Mikuláš Huba, formed a new division of Ochranári in Bratislava. Huba's group, they called these smaller groups basic organizations. I guess you might call them local chapters. Huba's group was assigned the number 6 by the Union Central Office. And his organization was interested in the relationship between nature and human habitats. Of course, he gets this interest from the field of geography. Up until this time, the Union's divisions basically consisted of people who collected wild plants, or they photographed fauna, or they cleaned up parks and forests during their free time. Alongside these sorts of weekend bird watchers and mushroom enthusiasts and volunteers, Huba and his group were interested not only in saving forests, but also in saving one type of almost forgotten cultural monument. And these monuments were not castles or statues or historic districts. Some of those structures had simply been knocked down, like the Jewish quarter in Bratislava, to make way for the bridge of the Slovak national uprising across the Danube in 1967. Instead, conservationists in Huba's group focused on humble drevenice, or wooden cabins, often isolated and scattered throughout the countryside, the dwellings of nameless common people. They were peasant structures of no real consequence to communist campaigns to reshape the environment into the socialist landscape. These drevenice, as relics, had been simply forgotten, left to decay on the sides of mountains and in lonely river valleys far from crowded socialist cities. Like other groups, number 6 was small. At first it was Huba, his brother Marco, who was an art teacher and a wood carver, and a few of their friends. They started out by traveling on weekends and in summer to a plateau in the Malafatra Mountains, on which rested a cluster of dilapidated peasant cabins called Podsheep, or Undersheep Peak, which they gradually began to restore. As the group's work progressed, they planned other projects and they organized brigades to hunt for other old buildings, tucked away in villages or hidden in the countryside. Now, the state did in fact designate some historical structures as protected, but due to limited budgets and bureaucratic neglect, many of these fell to ruin. And Huba's group did not intend to directly challenge these official bodies of state monument protection. Rather, they really simply sought to make up where the government was not involved. Huba described number 6 in the Union as offering the help of eager volunteers. And since their work did in fact appear to be useful, it actually fit rather well into the 1970s rhetoric of productivity, which so often was repeated in Marxist worker slogans, and you would see these all over the city. Party apparatchiks often puzzled over, but actually never challenged directly the Ochranári's renovation projects. In the words of one member I interviewed, he told me that the party bureaucrats were often really confused about us. They could not believe that we would spend so much effort doing something of a volunteer nature and for no real gain, fixing up old buildings. Yet the members of number 6 gained much from their care and their renovation of drevenice. In addition to being a much-needed vacation from urban socialism, their renovation projects were an exercise in protecting what they considered to be Slovakia's natural and historical ecosystem. Huba described the group as preventing the destruction of the genuine culture of our predecessors. And for these particular Ochranári, the message of folk architecture in place was as much a part of nature conservation as other more conventional spheres of what people understood to be ecology. They viewed these buildings as the work of anonymous architects of national culture, the peasants, the shepherds, the woodcutters, and the miners who had lived a life of harmony with the natural world. Over the next few years, the group grew to 40 members, and they carried out volunteer brigades to restore dozens of buildings, an 80-year-old church near Bratislava, an abandoned shepherd's shelter in Kokavka, and a 200-year-old mill in Kvachian or Kvachianska Dolina, that river valley near the Tatras. This new type of conservationism was also an exercise in traditional living and mingling with the rural poor, and in its way, a sort of protest against normalized urban society. This controversial theme had been raised earlier in the decade, in the 70s, by Dušan Hanak, the Slovak documentary filmmaker. In his 1972 film, Pictures of the Old World, or Obrazy Starého Sveta, which I highly recommend that you see, Hanak vividly recorded the lives of elderly rural Slovaks. Although many lived in abject poverty, their narratives expressed a deep sense of independence, uniqueness, and endurance in the face of history's callous conformity to socialist progress. A particular concern of Hanak's lens was the elements of traditional life of Slovaks, tools, songs, art, and their architecture. The film was immediately criticized by the Czechoslovak regime for its aesthetics of ugliness, and it was banned by the Communist Party. Indeed, it was not until after the Velvet Revolution that Hanak's work was shown publicly in Slovakia, and I saw it in Trnava in 1994 when it was shown for the very first time there. Hanak's villagers were very similar to the elderly residents who lived near the Okranari's conservation projects, who had been at best forgotten and at worst purposefully ignored in the politics of socialism. The Okranari's work also was related to the ubiquitous chata culture of private garden plots on which people were allowed to work on the outskirts of the even more crowded and industrializing cities. And the Okranari also invoked the growing tramping or trekking movement, where hikers and walkers wandered forests and camped in fields and state parks to escape the gray urbanizing and industrializing world. So there were these other things that were happening in society at this time. But the conservation efforts of Number 6 in the Union were much more focused and pointedly discursive than trekking or gardening. The anachronistic sekerka, or hatchet, pulled from the context of folk dance and art, like the valashka, which the Okranari used to rebuild their drevenice as tools, represented an increasingly open and free lifestyle, where people could gather and talk not only about the environment, but about Slovak society and culture. One did not need requisition forms from the party bureaucrats to make wooden shingles or to mend cabin walls, as they chopped wood and patched the cracks between ceiling beams. Number 6 members later gathered after the day's work to discuss social problems and to debate issues that went far beyond architecture and preservation. Those issues were things like healthcare and the growing problem of pollution. And what the Okranari did next brought nature into a cultural confrontation with the regime. Back in the city, after their projects, the Okranari continued to meet each month as a group, and they started attracting more members who heard about their work and about their way of life. By the mid-1980s, the Okranari in Number 6 decided to carry out research in their own fields of expertise in the state of the environment around their beloved city of Bratislava. They also quietly asked scholars and scientists at universities and at hospitals and at technical institutes to help them gather this information. In October of 1987, the Ochranari published their research. And they did this very cleverly. They did it in the guise of an appendix to the group's meeting minutes. Think about that for a minute. So they met and their minutes, and they published the minutes, but really an appendix to the minutes. The title of the report, Zelení Nahlas, alluded to Gorbachev's recent Soviet reforms. Nahlas, the Slovak adverb loudly or aloud, invoked the Soviet leader's policy of increasing openness. So it was, in the title was a signal to the public of in line with glasnost, what was going on in the Soviet regime. In keeping with the theme of openness, the report's 23 authors acted as a collective. They identified themselves on the inside cover, but nobody was listed in the particular chapters. And they also openly identified names of professionals that they had consulted. So there was this kind of group expression of public openness and honesty. The 16 chapters of Zelení Nahlas were vivid presentations of the ecological problems plaguing Slovakia's capital city. The language of the text moved easily from technical concepts to detailed ethnography. It specifically identified Bratislava's localities, its well-known streets, neighborhoods, parks, and industries. Each chapter focused on a particular aspect of pollution or health. And together, this work unveiled a comprehensive portrait of a city and its people in an unfolding environmental crisis. The report began with an alarming description of the city's air pollution and evidence of its sources. It alerted readers to the case of several employees of the Dimitrov chemical factory, all of whom had been hospitalized for brain damage due to the inhalation of hydrogen monosulfide. The city's chemical industries, combined with exhaust from its motor traffic, resulted in a concentration of particle pollution in the town center that was 13 times normal levels. In the sphere of water quality, the report described how the Slovnaft and oil and chemical works dumped tons of unprocessed petroleum waste into the Danube River. Overall city water quality was disturbingly poor, with only 48% of all industrial waste, plus household sewage undergoing proper purification. Not only were surface waters seriously contaminated, but the large underground lake beneath Bratislava was critically threatened by waste seepage from Slovnaft and other industries. The report also described how local hospitals discarded low-level nuclear waste directly into the public sewage system after undergoing an ineffective dilution process. And finally, the report also warned residents about a planned nuclear power plant in the Bratislava suburb of Mlynské Dolina, where 70,000 people would be living within a 2-kilometer radius of its Chernobyl-style reactors. And about Chernobyl, information about the 1986 nuclear accident in Ukraine was still unknown, even after a year of its occurrence. In addition to these nightmares regarding the city's natural conditions, the report detailed the unhealthy conditions of the city's social environment. Noise pollution was heavy practically everywhere in the city. Living conditions in highly concentrated apartment blocks were unsafe, and services were woefully inadequate. Healthcare was of low quality, and there was not enough hospital beds or medications in Bratislava for patients who needed them. If these problems were not alarming enough, the report also revealed that Bratislava had the highest number of tumor-related deaths in Slovakia, and that incidents of cardiovascular diseases, infant mortality, and miscarriages had all increased dramatically over the previous 2 decades. The authors never explicitly implicated the regime in its report as being responsible for these maladies. They didn't have to, though. Instead, they were simply describing reality. And this description alarmed and also electrified the public. And it gave them a common message. Zelení Nahlas turned the socialist world upside down, exposing it to be not an orderly and purposeful society with the promise of equal opportunity, but an environment that was not only disorderly, but downright dangerous to human life. And the regime was so caught off guard and unable to substantively counter any of the arguments presented in the report. Instead, the state relied on its usual tactics of totalitarian power. First, the secret police tried unsuccessfully to confiscate all the copies of the damning text. In order to publish anything under state socialism, you had to mark each copy of what you printed with a print count. And like other organizations, the Conservation Union as a whole was allowed a certain limit of editions for their newsletter, which they did publish, called Ochranca Prírody, or Nature Protection, which I don't have time to go into, but was a monthly newsletter that they had. But since Zelení Nahlas was published as meeting minutes, it did not need to be officially reviewed by the union's central committee. These weren't party members, but they also was the only place where there was any kind of oversight. And the Ochranari had made 3,000 copies of Zelení Nahlas, way beyond whatever quota their organization was allowed. And also people made clandestine copies. In other words, they self-published and photocopied. This image that I show you today is a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of the actual document. And I do have the actual document in my materials, but it's at my locked office in Manhattan, and I'm unable to access it. So I had to rely on someone's photocopy. They would pass around these copies to their friends and around town, or leave them outside of cafes. The secret police couldn't find them all. Next, the secret police attempted to interrogate the list of authors, but specific names could not be matched directly to separate chapters, and there were too many authors for them to really go after. And one of the authors, Maria Filkova, who I interviewed, said she was one of the researchers on the project, said I told the police everybody wrote everything. And I wasn't going to admit what I wrote, and I wasn't going to not admit that we didn't write it, if you could follow that. People whispered to the Ochranari over the few days after its publication on the street corners and in cafes, "Držím vám palce," or "I'm holding my thumbs for you," or in English, "I'm crossing my fingers." And they would say this to let them know that people cared about what they wrote and that the city was in their corner. The authorities next tried to discredit the report's contents in the press. In Pravda, the official newspaper of the Slovak Communist Party, in a piece entitled Nic nového pod slnkom, or Nothing New Under the Sun, the Ochranari were openly accused of manipulating data and misrepresenting information so that the group could subvert the state. The author's name was simply Pani Piškarová. Huba and his colleagues answered these allegations by demanding to see the article's author. And they quickly discovered that this name, Piškarová, was a stolen name. It turned out that Pani Piškarová was a 72-year-old woman caring for her 80-year-old invalid husband. And upon meeting members of Number 6, Huba and others, not only did she tell them she did not write the article, but she said that she admired their work and she joined the organization that very day. And in this picture here, Pani Piškarová is at an event that people started to hold, kind of outside meetings and talking about the environment. And they're wearing these pins that the organization Sadza Opaka developed to, it's like an I support the environment pin, and I support the environment of Slovakia. The party finally just resorted to accusing the Ochranari without any additional evidence of being enemies of socialism. But by this time, no one was listening to the regime. Many instead were flocking to the Conservation Union's meetings, and they were asking their doctors about their own well-being. If the preservation of folk architecture brought culture into the realm of nature, Zelení Nahlas brought the environment and ecology to the urban arena of socialist culture, and it elevated the Ochranari to widespread popularity. This group demystified the world that state socialism built, and people wanted to hear more about it. From its humble beginnings in 1977, with 20 members, Kuba's group number 6 exceeded 600 persons going to their meetings by 1988. That's a lot of people to put into a room. Its popularity spilled over to other divisions of the union, which had different district organizations and local clubs or basic organizations, local chapters, all across the country. And in less than 3 years, the union's official ranks swelled to over 30,000. And that number is probably much higher because a lot of people simply just didn't officially join. The rest of the story is even more remarkable. On November 18th, in 1989, Jan Budaj, an Ochranar and a member of Number 6, and also one of the authors of Zelení Nahlas, joined the actor Milan Knažko on the main stage, leading the mass demonstrations during the Velvet Revolution in Slovakia. And if you notice his Zelení pin prominently on his jacket. The Ochranari's modest Bratislava office, where they met to plan their brigades, became the first central headquarters of Verejnosť proti násiliu, or Public Against Violence, which was the civic union in Slovakia that, along with Václav Havel's Civic Forum in Prague, finally wrested power from the communists. And you can see Budaj and Knažko, and I think Fedor Gal is there too. He was a member of Bratislava's basic organization number 6. So this account is the first part of my book. And in the second half, I describe the troubling collapse of the environmental movement in the wake of economic reform and in the wake of the emergence of Slovak nationalism and the issue of independence. And in little over 5 years, membership in the union really plummets. But that is a story for another time. What I hope to show you here is a story of the Ochranari's role in challenging oppression. I believe it's a lesson in the power of volunteerism, and about the story of a love for traditional culture that serves as a check against totalitarian ideology that is obsessed with blind progress. In Slovakia, the members of Number 6 spoke honestly and with scientific data in speaking truth to power. And it is the spirit of that caring and preserving Slovak history and culture of all of society in the face of that oppression that I try to capture in the first half of my book. So thank you for listening, and I would be more than happy to take your questions. Here, I'm going to go to the chat. Okay, so the first question is, did the Slovak government try to co-opt the movement? That's a really good question, and I guess I need to clarify what government we're talking about. The government during the Czechoslovak regime didn't really have time to do much in terms of trying to co-opt, and the kind of resistance that was developing all throughout the East European regimes came from very different places in different societies. For example, in East Germany, it was the peace movement, and it was the church. In Slovakia, there was so much focus on Catholicism and Jan Charnogorski's secret church, that it was almost kind of a diversion away from what was happening in the volunteer environmental sector. What does happen afterwards, though, is once that regime collapses, the idea of nature protection and environmentalism becomes a really kind of up for grabs by all kinds of political movements to grab onto and define and to control. And I deal with that in the second half of my book in a lot of detail. I will add that when the regime came out against the conservationists, that there wasn't really, they really didn't know how to respond. And it was a remarkable situation where very quickly the mood on the street was one of the ideas of, you know, I mean, the environment is something that the regimes have failed at, and there's nothing that they are going to say about this or do that. And that became very important. But after the regime's collapse, everybody wants to get in on environmentalism, and Mikuláš Huba was actually a member elected to the member of the first Slovak parliament as a member of the Green Party. And his tenure was actually rather short because he found the political environment to be very, very hard to deal with and address. His work was mostly in science and in conservation. Okay, let me look at another question here. Did the organization have any connections with workers in the trade unions who also were protesting pollution? Yes, they did. They were very much in tune with other parts of society who, in addition to not only trade unions, but also the youth movement. And there was an organization called Strom Života, which was kind of like a branch of the Slovak Union of Youth, and they had a counterpart in the Czech Republic. But the organization would publish articles about any kind of activity that any group was doing after the Bratislava Nahlas came out, and the kind of like floodgates were open in all kinds of newsletters and magazine articles, and people really started to talk about the environment in a really kind of a broad-based way. Oh, and I see, yes, Michael Kapanek has shared a Radio Free Europe research on pollution in Slovakia in 1986. Yes. Okay. Spell the name of the number 6 leader. H-U-B-A, Huba. And his first name is Mikuláš. And this from, oh wait, there was another one here about saying a few words about nuclear plants in Slovakia, past and present. So the cover of my book is an image of Jaslovská Bohunica, and this was built, it had a Chernobyl-style reactor. It was located outside of Bratislava, so the project to build a nuclear power plant in Mlynské Dolina was never realized. But what was realized and built during the time of my research there, and I write a lot about this in the book itself, was nuclear power plant Machovska. And this plant really became a target of what the post-socialist environmental movement in Slovakia was all about, and focusing on in terms of its kind of a rallying cry. What happened with that movement, though, and there was a lot of anti-nuclear activism in Europe, both East and West at the time. A lot of international organizations became involved in that issue and kind of latched onto, sponsored, and maybe even sort of appropriated everything that Slovaks locally were doing in terms of their work and their mission and their campaigns. And even the organization that I worked with and had done a lot of participant observation with, which was called Activism, Slovakia, it's kind of an offshoot of another larger international organization from Mother Earth, which has branches everywhere. Greenpeace as well came in and established a headquarters and really kind of took on and promoted the anti-nuclear movement. One of the things, though, that my book covers, which does happen right after the revolution, is the controversy about the Gabčíkovo-Náš Dam. That was, part of it was in Slovakia on the Slovak part of the Danube, and the other part was in Hungary. And a lot of Hungary's environmental movement actually coalesced around that dam issue during socialism in a way that it did not in Slovakia. However, once Slovakia kind of broke away from the Czech Republic, which happens only 3 years after the fall of the regime, 3 or 4 years after that, the Gabčíkovo Dam becomes a huge symbol of Slovak nationalism and identity. And unfortunately, a lot of the conservationists also started to protest the dam project in the early days in 1990 and 1991. And this really became a kind of a reputation where they lost all of the things that they had built in a moral sense as the society itself shifted. So what happens in this story is a lot of transformations and dynamics are occurring on so many levels, on the level of a social movement, on the level of the political discourse and the political narrative, the emergence of nationalism, and then all of those things which become objects of and rallying points around. And a lot of the older Ochranari told me that they felt almost dizzy with the pace at which everything was happening once things started to really open up there. Nuclear power continues to be a problem to this day, and I think it is a large focus of the movements now. But it was almost like the thing you couldn't talk about during that time. And I see a comment here from David Frankel. We overlapped our stay in Bratislava. I was there 91 to 95. Aha. Tell us about the environmental impacts of the Gabčíkovo Dam. So I cover a lot of this in the second part of the book, and I use it as a case study. But I'm more interested in describing the politics around it than the actual environmental impacts. And from my understanding of the technical issues about it, there was a lot of wetlands and kind of certain type of local ecosystem, which a lot of scientists and environmentalists and people at the Academy of Science and Comenius University, for example, were very interested in kind of protecting and preserving that. But the project itself was really an issue about energy and energy dependence, which really becomes one of those things where you see how environmental issues are so malleable and can transform as political contexts transform, that the actual issues about preservation, issues about diversity, issues about very technical and scientific issues about local species, it's hard to push those things in a place where everything has now been opened up as a political discussion, especially Slovakia's future, which at the time was very much, being watched by the outside world as what's going to happen to Slovakia, what's going to happen to the Czech Republic. And also at the time, we saw the breakup of Yugoslavia, which was an example of a multi-ethnic state going in the wrong direction, and people were very concerned about that story. Mečiar's government, its view towards environmentalism, if any Ochranar that I spoke to would tell you absolutely and utterly not in the service of any kind of environmental issue. What they would say is that Mečiar's government tried to really co-opt the idea of nature preservation as a Slovak duty to preserve the nation, and yet any of their actual substantive programs or supports, their support for nuclear energy, their support for the Gapčíkova Dam, their support for other industries, were not in line with what had developed under socialism in this society as part of a worldview. Can you compare the dire situation you've outlined in the 80s, 90s to the environmental situation today? So this book, I finished the field work for this book and I wrote it as a dissertation, and then was involved in other research elsewhere somewhat rather quickly when I got my PhD, and ended up for a long time going to Central Asia and many other Eastern European countries, including Russia. And then staying in touch with the field was difficult, and also staying in touch with the issues in the field was challenging. And by the time I actually got it put as a manuscript, you were talking 10, 15 years had gone by. But my focus in finishing it and working on it was really paying attention to the archive and the sources that I had. And then not too long ago, not too long after that, in about 2013, I reconnected with environmentalists, mainly through the internet, and found that there's the same environmental issues that Slovakia was experiencing under socialism are persisting, and not a lot of progress has been made on that front. One of the issues that is facing Europe right now and the world is climate change. Very broad-based topic. It's very general, it's very global, but a lot of what was the energy and the force of the movement under socialism was that local experience of being in a place and thinking about the value of that place rather than thinking more broadly about the planet. Did the union work with Charter 77? Yes, they did. There was one Ochranar named Pavel Schremer, who was a Slovak signature. There were 3 signers of Charter 77, which was kind of a dissident document, mostly known in the Czech part of the country at the time. And I believe Schremer was a Czech living in Slovakia. And I interviewed a lot of people about their connection as dissidents, and many of them did know a lot of dissidents, mainly from the circles in which they came as intellectuals, as scholars, as researchers. But they were very careful most of the people were very careful not to describe themselves in any way as dissidents. One sociologist, Martin Butora, who also went into politics post-revolution, called these conservationists positive deviants, and had this framework in which he described conservationists as being necessary in their deviance to help bring society into a new framework of freedom and democracy and things like that. But there was not a lot of close work with other dissidents, and the Secret Church, for example, in one of their monthly magazines, the Slovak Union, in 1988, I believe it was, actually interviewed Charnogorsky, and someone got to interview Pope John Paul II. And I know that he was instrumental in the story of the collapse of communism in many ways, and religion in many ways. But their identity as not dissidents, but deviants, they embraced wholeheartedly, and in this way that they felt that they were kind of like authentic Slovaks. This becomes a problem, just to kind of extend this out, when the issue of independence with Slovakia and the whole separation started, especially around 91, 92, because a lot of the Okranari were, in their minds, Czechoslovaks. Slovaks for sure, but the idea that you were going to separate these republics and separate these societies was very painful for a lot of people in that original number 6 union. So it was. I also cover that in another part of the book. It deals with that separation and the emergence of nationalism. I recall Hungary decided not to complete its portion of the Gabčíkovo Dam project, and this led to litigation. Yes, but so that was the success of the Danube Circle and the path that Hungarians took in their fight, which had a direct impact, and I believe it was, in kind of a more international relations sphere, something that Hungary was a big standout when all this was going on in terms of what its identity was as a socialist state. It was much freer, much more open. It had started to adopt market reforms, and I think that there was this feeling like we don't need that dam. We can figure something else out. And there was litigation, although I'm not exactly sure how that was resolved ultimately. Although I should, and I bet you if I wake up tomorrow morning, I will actually remember that. But my colleague Krista Harper is an anthropologist at UMass Amherst, and she has written quite a bit on what happened in Hungary after the collapse of communism and the fate of those movements and the fate of the fight against the dam and how it kind of became appropriated into a model of neoliberalist economics. And of course, Hungary today is very much on the right, which is a big issue. One difference I noticed today is no longer I smell coal burning in Bratislava. and interestingly, I remember the breaking of the glass that people would throw into their recycling bins. One of the things that people realized after socialism collapsed was actually how ecological many parts of socialist life were, except for the coal. And one of the things that is really interesting is when you go to Almaty in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, and you fly into the airport, you can smell the wood burning from all of the fires that people have, whether it's food preparation or some villages have these heating systems. And it's very kind of a sensual experience of what is going on in that society. Bratislava, now I have not been back to Slovakia since 1995, and it is on my list. And at some point, I know COVID came, I was actually planning a return trip, and I would love to see how things are going and how things have changed in that environment. Does Slovakia primarily rely on nuclear power? I know that the hydropower is very important. And their nuclear power plants, two of them, I believe, are working. Yes, it's a significant part of their energy. It's a country of 5 million plus. And it's very critical. This is why when you go after these very, very big, high profile sources of energy, it's very difficult for an ecology movement or environmental activists to really get traction among the local communities, because people understand that there's a lot at stake in trying to switch over and trying to change. Oh, I see David has informed us that it was a split decision. Yeah, both sides could walk away. I believe that, yeah, that was, so it was kind of an anticlimax of that international court lawsuit. And Michael asks, when I lived in Bratislava during communism, doing my dissertation research, I used used to ride my bicycle along the Danube since it was the cleanest air and I could hardly breathe from the bad pollution in the city. Yeah, some days temperature inversions, and I believe this is still the case with the small Carpathian Mountains and the way that Bratislava is set up. And you know, I was over in Košice too at one point, and feeling that was a cleaner city to me than what Bratislava was like. But I remember things floating in the air, which I believe people said, oh, that's from Slovnaft, and maybe that's some kind of plastics processing that's going on at the chemical plant. Yeah, so it was an interesting experience at that time, and I'm sure under socialism, I wasn't there. I was there in '93 and on, what it was like. So these are all just fascinating and great questions, and I really, really appreciate your time and attention and you asking them. I would love to come back and maybe present a little bit on the second half of the book and things that I have been doing and published with environmentalism in Slovakia since. Helen asks, among those who oppose nuclear power, is the desired resolution to shut down the power plants or retool them? That's a very good question. The protections, the safety systems were such an important element of the anti-Machovce campaign by a lot of the organizations that I worked with doing participant observation, and of which there were a lot of town meetings and civic events where people would simply say, why can't you have the most up-to-date safety system? But I believe that the engineering and the contracts for these big projects were already in place, and it was basically like a Soviet supplier and kind of like a done deal of like big development that happens today in this day and age. Yeah, soot from pollution made all the buildings appear gray and dingy. And I know that there was some cleanup effort. Some places were actually being renovated in Michalska Brana, and other places in the Stare Mesto were just miraculously appearing as renovated and painted and refurbished and revamped. And I'm so curious to see what it looks like now today. I've actually been living in Brooklyn, New York, and over the last 18 years, I've seen the transformation of this city of 2.5 million people through gentrification kind of unfold in a very dramatic way. Has the acid rain problem cleared up with the turn away? So I don't know that. That's a very good question. One of the biggest acid rain sources was Poland. And there was a lot of talk about that. There was an environmental movement in Poland as well. But because Solidarity was so prominent and so well organized and so linked, and then the Catholic Church also had this great movement, the environmentalists in Poland weren't as powerful and as visible as they were in, say, for example, Slovakia. Yes, I hope it has cleared up. Austria tried to hold up Slovakia's entry into the EU until Slovakia agreed to end its nuclear power generation. I thought the issue was resolved. Yeah, that could be. And yes, Global 2000 was an Austrian organization that infiltrated the group that I was working with, and they pretty much told the group that the most important issue was nuclear power, and that our country is not going to allow you to be who you want to be or develop and emerge in that way. So there are these kind of EU politics at play here in these movements, but I don't know that the young activists that I was running with really understood more of those global politics in terms of what they were fighting for. They were really trying to fight against Chernobyl-style accident, and then the experience of that problem as information about it came out. By the time I was there, yes, everybody knew about it, and I met several activists from Ukraine and Belarus who were the children of Chernobyl, who told absolute nightmare stories about things that had happened to their family members as the result of that accident. Okay, I am wondering how my time is. These are all really wonderful questions.
It's about 3:20, so we're doing pretty well.
Okay, good. Yeah. One of the things that I really cover in the book in great detail is what happens with what is really one of the first Green parties, successful Green parties in post-socialist politics, and how the split between the Czech and Slovak republics at that time in 92 and 93 really destroyed that idea of a Green political party. And also how the issues that environmentalists were carving out, were linking, how those issues really got lost in the politics of Green parties, which stand for so much more than simply just environmental issues. And especially if you look at that, Slovaks were looking for a model of a new type of Green party in Europe. And there was a lot of debate about that. And yet time got them, and then the post-revolutionary economic reforms and issues and nationalism also got them. The Green Party, which was small, the Green Party of Slovakia, actually split into two political parties, one that was an anti-independence and one that was a pro-independence movement. As soon as that happened, they effectively became ineffective. And then an interesting thing that does also happen is that the renovation of folk architecture becomes incorporated into a symbol of kind of the national independence movement of Slovakia, much to the chagrin of a lot of old-time Ochranari who were working to renovate these projects. And then people started to use them to promote tourism, which is not a bad idea. Ecotourism is certainly a model that works, but I think that a lot of Slovaks who had worked under communism felt very uncomfortable about that capitalist economy, which is interesting because they really were true socialists in their sensibility. Do you follow any of the current energy topics, the debate over Nord Stream and its potential effect on Slovakia? No, I would certainly love to. This is one of the things that happens when you do a long-term project. You write a dissertation, you write a book, and then in many ways, you get onto another project. And as an anthropologist, one of the things about my work process is that the immersion into a society becomes so intense that it's hard to follow the new things that are going on in older field sites. And I'm actually struggling with this with Central Asia because the last time I was there was, now at this point it's more, 15 years or more. And yet I am trying to stay active in issues that I studied in those contexts. And of course, I've been working on this project in Brooklyn, and the environment is a huge issue here. Seeing how things have changed, I'm so eager to kind of look at what is happening in the post-socialist states and in the EU in general. And it's on my to-do list.
All right, we still have time for a few more questions if folks have them. So don't be shy.
One of the things that I can say, if people are thinking about something to ask, is there was a very interesting part of field work where I would ask people what it was like when the borders opened. And a colleague of mine, Juraj Podoba, who does write in Slovakia on environmental issues still, he's an ethnologist, and a couple of other people gave just incredible descriptions of what it was like to move from Bratislava in 1989 to just go across the border to Austria. And he said that literally an exodus of thousands of Slovaks went into this town on the border called Hainburg in Austria, and just quietly and with no talking were just in awe at what was on the shelves in the stores, and going through the town and seeing that kind of conspicuous consumption, consumer culture. These were not things that were available even in 1993 and 94 when I was in Bratislava. I don't believe any fast food restaurant had established any kind of prominence there. I think Pizza Hut was one of the first ones that opened with a contract in Bratislava, and of course Kmart came in. But to hear the stories that people would talk about visiting and being able to pass that border was a really, really interesting experience to kind of capture and have. And I might actually write a little bit about that experience from my notes from those days. Yeah, Slovakia is doing a great job with bicycling. That's wonderful. And bike tourism. And I can see that. And I think that is absolutely a wonderful thing, especially for these European cities. Brooklyn is doing this. Manhattan has done it. And it is transformative. It really is. David says, my most treasured remembrance from my years living and working in Slovakia is a piece of the barbed wire that separated Bratislava from Austria. Yes. It's incredible how that country was right, that city was just right there. You could go up the hill outside. I can't remember the name of the park, and I went there hiking with people several times. And you would go up on this clearing, and there was like a plateau, and you could overlook the Danube River Valley and just look right into Austria. It was so close, and yet, in the words of so many of the people that I interviewed at that time, so far away. And it was a serious reality under normalization for them. The fact that Hanuk's film was shown at an ethnology conference, so many people came out to see this film. Yeah, the area around Děvín Castle, I think so, yes. And there's an area not near the castle, but a place that kind of opens up, and below you is the Danube. It's a stunning sight. But Hanuk's film was, people were like, I've never seen anything like that before. Ethnographic films, documentary films that were really for realism there. There's a couple of shots in his film that takes you into the socialist city. And that's very interesting to kind of see the difference between the urban and the rural. Urbanization is a huge issue in the history of Europe and other places, which occurs so rapidly, not like, say, in the United States and other places, that it literally empties out villages. This is true in Spain and Franco Spain, as it is in places like Slovakia, where they couldn't build those apartment buildings fast enough. The industrializing process, and so you see the actual physical and human geography of the city. Yeah, I mean it's a pollution problem just waiting to happen. So it's interesting to see how that developed. Any other questions? Oh, you might be interested that there was a Czech Union of Nature Protection, and it did not have the name Landscape Protection. And so the Slovaks had a distinctive claim to anything that was in the landscape. which was kind of conflated with this idea of nature. And Mikuláš Huba and Josef Vavrošek, who was head of that union, he became the Minister of the Environment for the Czech Republic. For a time, he was kind of much more involved in politics. We're great friends. But while I was there, he died in an avalanche while hiking with his daughter, and he and his daughter died. And I went with Huba and a lot of the Okranari later to the site where the accident had occurred, and they put memorials and put crosses and had a series. But Huba always said that because he died, was one of the most tragic things to happen to the environmental movement for Czech or Slovak people, because he was such a promoter of the issue post the collapse of communism. Oh, many Bratislava residents now moved to nearby Austrian towns. Real estate prices are lower, and they commute. This makes sense. Yeah, that's great. I had a friend who was living in Vienna while I was living in Bratislava, and he worked for a film company. He was a buddy from college. The difference in price and the difference in life between that city and Bratislava was like night and day. And now I'm very curious how those things are different or not, how they've caught up. And clearly, I mean, Slovakia is doing well then. Yeah.
Okay, looks like that's. I guess we'll wrap up our presentation today. So I want to let everyone know that we will be sending out to everyone who registered for this event links to Edward Snajdr's book that's available through the University of Washington Press, and also on Amazon, I presume, also. And we'll also be this presentation has been recorded, so we'll be posting that very soon onto our YouTube channel, and we'll have a link to it on our website. So I would like to thank Edward for giving us a very informative presentation today, and I wish everyone to enjoy the rest of their Saturday afternoon, and we hope to see you in the future.
Thank you very much for having me. Ahojte.
Ahojte.